Having already reviewed the rather quirky BYD Atto 3, I was curious to see how the smaller sibling, the Atto 2, would compare, and of course in comparison to some of its rivals. Now, at the time of filming and in the UK, the Atto 2 can be found in two trims. You have got the Boost at roughly £31,000 and then the Comfort, which can be found for roughly £35,000, of course without adding any additional options. Now, in this video, which will be covered in such a format, we'll see if it's actually worth its price tag and of course how it compares to some of its key competitors. So to kick things off, let's talk about its electric range. And here it's great to see that across the entire trim range, you've actually got a heat pump that comes included as standard. That's certainly useful for the overall efficiency and also for those colder climate days, because for those people who are not aware, it will take heat that's dissipated from the vehicle's electronics, such as, for example, the battery pack, and feed it back into the cabin in a safe way. Now, you have also got a BYD blade battery, and here you've got an LFP chemistry, and that stands for lithium iron phosphate. Now, in the entry-level Boost model, you have got a 51.1 kilowatt-hour battery pack, and according to the WLTP mixed driving cycle, that'll give you roughly 214 miles of range. While in the Comfort model, you've got a 64.8 kilowatt-hour battery pack, and that will give you roughly 267 miles, at least on the WLTP test cycle. Now, the vehicle that's on review is actually the entry-level Boost. I'm actually pretty pleased about that because it gives it a bit of a better entry point. And here you've actually got a tested figure of 190 to 210 miles. So yes, indeed, very close to the manufacturer's claim, which is the same that could be said about a lot of its rivals. I'd imagine that the Comfort model will be able to attain roughly 230 to 250 miles, although I haven't quite put it through its paces. Given my overall experience of the Boost model and also of other BYD vehicles, I do expect this to actually sit true. Now, there is also regenerative braking, and through the infotainment system you've got a standard and a high mode. Now, the actual high mode, driving at 50 miles an hour and lifting off the accelerator pedal, does recoup energy at a much more rapid rate, let's say in comparison to the standard mode, which will feel like it's coasting a little bit more. However, it still doesn't give you that one pedal drive, which is actually quite a shame because some of its competitors do offer that, and when it comes to just pottering around town, it means that you can drive with a singular pedal. Unfortunately, that's not quite the case with the BYD Atto 2, and I do think here the manufacturer has kind of missed a trick. So aside from recouping energy while on the move, you can also plug it in. And here it will take up to 82 to 155 kilowatts of power via its CCS port, allowing you to go from 10 to 80% in roughly 25 to 38 minutes. It's also got an 11 kilowatt onboard charger, allowing you to go from 0 to 100% when connected up to an appropriate charger, from 5.5 to roughly 7.5 hours. Of course, it'll take a lot longer on a 3-pin input. It's also nice to see that you've got vehicle-to-load charging supported on both models. That effectively allows you to discharge the battery pack to, for example, power a household appliance, which can be handy if you go camping. So moving swiftly on, we get onto the overall driving comfort. And first off, in terms of cabin noise, it's not exactly the best, nor is it the worst. You'll hear a little bit of road noise creeping in on the motorway, like we are on right now, and there's a little bit of wind deflecting off the A-pillars and the wing mirrors. In all honesty, it's not too shabby, so nothing to overly complain about. Now, as for the overall suspension system, here I do find it intriguing that BYD have offered two different configurations. In the Boost model, which is on review, you have got a MacPherson setup at the front, while at the rear you've got a torsion beam setup. While in the Comfort model, you've got a multi-link system at the back, and therefore means that it should, in theory, as the name might suggest, be a little bit more comfortable on those drives. Now, what I will say is that while driving the Boost model, I did find that it did suffer from a little bit of that seesawing effect, namely on more challenging routes. And equally, when it came to going over speed bumps, the rebound effect that could be felt on the suspension system was actually pretty severe. So therefore, just something worth considering. Don't get me wrong, it's not too terrible and something that would put me off the Atto 2 altogether, but just something I thought I should highlight in this review. Now, aside from that, it is also worth mentioning that it's not exactly a sporty SUV, and therefore it hasn't got that sort of one-to-one connection with the front axle. There's also a lot of body lean that can be felt. In comparison to the Atto 3, I actually do prefer driving the Atto 2 because I feel that its suspension configuration and the overall platform feels better tuned for a B segment vehicle in comparison to the C segment Atto 3. But of course, that's a little bit subjective, so if you have got the chance of driving both vehicles, I'll definitely urge you to do that so you can understand better as to what BYD are offering, and also comparing, contrasting it with some of its key competitors. For example, the one that really springs to mind is a Citroën EC3, the EC4 and the EC4X, which have got a really floaty-like suspension system. So moving on, we get onto performance, and at the time of filming, both the models have got a front-wheel drive configuration. The Boost has got 130 kilowatts of power, or 174 horsepower, and 290 newton meters of torque, while the Comfort model has got 150 kilowatts of power, or 201 horsepower, and 310 newton meters of torque. Both of them are claimed to go from 0 to 62 miles an hour in 7.9 seconds. However, using RaceLogic's Performance Box Touch, I had the Boost model tested from 0 to 20 miles an hour in 2.01 seconds, 0 to 30 miles an hour in 2.98 seconds, 0 to 60 miles an hour in 7.48 seconds, and 50 to 70 miles an hour in 4.35 seconds. I also recorded a peak acceleration of 0.49 G. There's also a top speed of 99 miles an hour, which would certainly suffice for the vast majority of consumers. So next up we get onto its interior design, and yes indeed it hasn't got that polarizing feel like you'd find in its larger sibling, the Atto 3. And in fact, in comparison to the vast majority of its competitors, it actually does ooze class. You've got nice use of materials around the dashboard, the door trims, the center console, and the upholstery and the stitching work are all absolutely fantastic. It's also great that the manufacturer has provided you a free option between black and beige, so it really depends in terms of your overall taste. Now, in terms of practicality, you have got a few physical buttons that are found towards the center console, for example, for you to initiate the different regen modes and also the drive modes themselves. And then you've also got physical buttons and dials on the steering wheel with traditional stalks. But the majority of your controls will actually be done on the fully digitalized 12.8-inch infotainment system, which is planted towards the center of the dashboard. In fact, very much like other BYD vehicles, it does also rotate, so therefore you can have a landscape and also a portrait format. Very much appreciated, for example, while using the built-in apps. However, it is worth considering that despite the fact that Android Auto and Apple CarPlay are supported over a wired and wireless transmission, the rotation function is not supported, which I do think is a somewhat limitation, and the same that could be said about other BYD vehicles. Furthermore, turn-based navigation data is not fed through to the fully digitalized 8.8-inch instrument cluster. This would have been an additional good inclusion by the manufacturer like you'd find on some rival alternatives. Nonetheless, the display itself will provide you all the key driving information that you need, such as the safety systems and operation, and of course your traversing speeds. I would like to highlight, however, that there is no head-up display, be it as an option or indeed as standard in the top spec trims. What you do find, however, is a pretty punchy 8-speaker audio system. It doesn't exactly do well across the sound frequency range and has got a bit of a dipped mid-range. However, for the vast majority of consumers, I think you'll find you'll be pleasantly surprised. In fact, here you'll be able to see some of the settings, and I would urge you to actually try it out for yourself because your hearing range and your music genre taste might differ from mine. So next up we get onto storage, and first off you have got the glove box, which has actually been optimized for right-hand drive vehicles. Then at the top of the center console you've got two areas with a non-slip material which can be handy for placing smartphones. In fact, over here, one of which has actually got 50 watt of wireless charging capabilities, which is actually pretty impressive. Further down, you've got two cup holders, which are little customizable inserts which can be removed, and then you've also got a pretty large area underneath the center armrest. Now, underneath the center console, you have got a 12-volt socket and two USB Type-C ports, one of which dispatches a whopping 60 watts of power and the other one 18 watts. Then here you'll also find a pretty large open area, which can be handy for placing slightly larger valuables. At the rear of the center console, you've also got a further two USB Type-C ports, each of which dispatch 18 watts of power. Next, we've got the door bins, where the front two will accommodate a 500ml bottle alongside some small to medium-sized valuables, while the rear two are unsurprisingly a little bit more limited. It is a shame, however, that the door bins have not been lined in a sort of fabric material, and as a result your loose change or keys will be heard rattling about when you're traversing on uneven terrain. And furthermore, there's no pull-down armrest compartment at the rear of the cabin, which would have revealed two cup holders like you'd find on some rival alternatives. So aside from storage within the cabin, we have to talk about its boot. And here you have got 400 litres or 1,340 litres if you drop down the seats in the Boost model. However, this extends up to 450 litres or 1,370 litres respectively in the Comfort model. Now it's pretty practical thanks to the fact you've got that hatchback design. However, I would like to point out that you have not got an electric tailgate, and that doesn't really bother me all that much. However, it is worth highlighting that some of its competitors do offer that functionality. And furthermore, given that the actual tailgate in the Atto 2 is relatively heavy, it means it's just some food for thought, so you might want to try it out. Now, you have got 60/40 rear split folding seats, a flat loading bay, and a pretty sizable underfloor compartment, which is very much appreciated as it allows you to take your charging cables or, for example, lesser used goods. Of course, you can use it in order to expand your overall storage you've got in the boot as well. Now, I mention this because at the front of the vehicle, underneath the bonnet, you have not got a frunk, and therefore means that here BYD have kind of missed a trick because they could have optimized the front of the vehicle as well and therefore offered some additional storage space. On that note, the roof load capacity in the Boost trim is rated at 50 kilograms, while the Comfort model moves over to 75 kilograms. And elsewhere, you should know that there is no towing capacity that's been rated by the manufacturer. So yet again, something that you might want to consider, especially if you're going to be hauling any sort of goods. Moving swiftly on, we get on to seating comfort, and here I was actually pretty impressed. Despite the Atto 2 being a little bit more of a compact SUV in comparison to its larger sibling, the Atto 3, it actually does provide good amount of spaciousness within the cabin. Within the driver seat and also the passenger seat, I had no problems whatsoever. And similarly at the rear of the cabin. Sure enough, headroom isn't exactly the best, and legroom could have been a little bit more optimized, but here I do think it will actually suffice. I'm just under 6 foot and it didn't feel uncomfortable in the slightest. In fact, I found that the rear middle seat was overly plush, which I actually really loved, and therefore means that it's actually even comfortable if you are 5 occupants who are sat within the Atto 2. Furthermore, it's good to see that the manufacturer has optimized the rear footwell design by keeping it completely flat. Elsewhere, I would like to point out that the front 2 seats are heated as standard, and so is the steering wheel. You've also got full electronic controls, which is very much appreciated. Here it is also worth mentioning that in the Comfort model, you have also got an electric lumbar support for the driver. As for the passenger seat, you have got 4-way controls in the Boost model and 6-way electronic controls in the Comfort model. And no matter which trim level you go for, you'll actually find a panoramic roof, which is very much appreciated because it draws in some nice light within the cabin. Of course, you have also got a sunshade should you wish to use it, and therefore means that you're not going to get sunburnt within the cabin, or of course, if you just want a little bit of extra privacy. This actually perfectly brings me onto its exterior design, and here I really do love what BYD have achieved with the Atto 2. It's got a nice stance on the road. At the front, you've got these pretty large headlights which feed into the somewhat center grille per se, and you've got this sort of cute shape, which is kind of reminiscent of the BYD Dolphin and, of course, its larger sibling, the Atto 3. Then towards the side, you have got 17-inch alloys that come fitted as standard, and I also do like the accents that can be found towards the side skirt, although I would have preferred if this was all body coloured, but alas, that's not the case. And you've also got these integrated door handles. They're actually pretty intuitive to use and also very easy to find even in low light conditions. As for the rear, it does actually look the part, namely due to the fact that the tail lights have almost got this twisted design and therefore gives it a really nice stance on the road. Frankly, when it comes to its overall exterior look, I've got no complaints whatsoever. As for your colours, it comes as standard in grey, although a green, white and black options are also available. This actually brings me on to safety, and here you've got adaptive and intelligent cruise control, which actually does work a treat, although I did find it to be a little bit hit and miss when it comes to the overall steering support. It was kind of veering to the left or the right, and therefore I had to often correct it. Then you've got intelligent speed limit control, lane departure assist, blind spot detection, where you can also pair this up with the indicator, in other words, to check for your surroundings, at least at lower speeds, and this will pop up on your infotainment system. And of course, if you don't want that, you can disable it. Then you've got door opening warning, traffic sign recognition, automatic emergency braking, and forward collision warning. Now, while these safety systems are very much appreciated, they are actually re-enabled every single time you power on the vehicle, which is some sort of regulatory requirement. And this can actually lead to a little bit of a cumbersome approach, because here some of the systems are a little bit too sensitive for my liking. For example, the driver attention warning, which often just was beeping at me for no given reason. And in order for you to disable some of the systems, you have to faff around with the infotainment system. And unfortunately over here, BYD have not provided you useful shortcuts on the steering wheel or, for example, on the stalks. And also when it comes to the infotainment system itself, it's not as well laid out as you might expect. For example, the driver assistance systems are actually a little bit different from the driver monitoring system, which is in another menu. Here I think that BYD could have actually grouped them up a little bit better to make it a little bit easier for the consumer to easily disable. Now finally, I would like to talk about parking and visibility. And here you have got rear collision warning and rear cross traffic alert with braking support. Again, both that come fitted as standard across the entire trim range. You also have front and rear sensors and a 360-degree camera system, which is actually pretty high res, therefore giving you good peace of mind from curbing your rims. Now in terms of visibility, I had no issues whatsoever towards the front. The A-pillars are also pretty well designed. You've got nice openings towards the side and also a nice window at the back. And furthermore, unlike some of its competitors, you've also got a rear wiper, which can be handy on those muddier terrains, or of course if it's just absolutely pouring down with rain, as it was when I was driving the vehicle. So with all that in mind, it brings us on to a verdict of the BYD Atto 2. And here I really do actually prefer it in comparison to the Atto 3, not only in terms of its interior design, but the overall package that BYD is actually offering. It is also relatively comfortable to drive, albeit sometimes a little bit hit and miss in terms of more challenging terrain. The overall performance is somewhat sufficient, at least for the target demographic, and the same could be said in terms of its overall handling characteristics as well. In terms of the interior, it's actually pretty practical. You've got good use of technology, a plethora of driver assistance systems that come featured as standard, decent amount of headroom and legroom for your rear occupants, and also good boot capacity. The question, however, is would you spend roughly £31,000 to £35,000 on this vehicle when there are a whole bunch of other electric SUVs that actually offer you either better range or indeed better value for money? Some of which I've reviewed will be down in the description below for your own consideration. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of the Atto 2 down in the comments section below, and of course if you'd pick it over some of the rival alternatives. As a reminder, if you do want to find some of the best deals for this vehicle, make sure you check it down in the links in the description below or the pinned comments. And if you enjoyed this detailed review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.